The bullet struck the wooden post 3 inches from where Clara Matthews stood, and instead of screaming, she grabbed the Winchester rifle leaning against the wagon wheel and fired back into the darkness beyond the campfire's glow. That single moment in the spring of 1876, just outside Deadwood in the Dakota Territory, changed everything about who she thought she was and who she would become. The man who emerged from the shadows wasn't the outlaw who had fired at her, but rather a mountain of muscle and leather who had already broken the shooter's arm and was dragging him by the collar like a misbehaving pup. "You hit?" The mountain man's voice rumbled like distant thunder as he tossed the would-be thief aside and strode toward Clara with surprising grace for someone who looked like he could uproot trees with his bare hands. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, and his buckskin shirt strained against arms and chest that spoke of years hauling traps, chopping wood, and surviving in country that killed softer men. Clara lowered the rifle, her hands remarkably steady despite her racing heart. "No, but I would have been if you hadn't shown up when you did." She studied him in the firelight, noting the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes and the way he moved like a predator, constantly aware of his surroundings. "Name's Caleb Stone." He kicked the groaning thief in the ribs, not hard enough to do real damage, but sufficient to ensure compliance. "This piece of trash is Johnny Reed, and he's been robbing travelers on this stretch for the past month. Sheriff in Deadwood will be pleased to see him. Clara Matthews." She extended her hand, and when Caleb took it, his palm engulfed hers completely. His grip was warm, careful, controlled strength that sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. "I'm heading to Deadwood to meet my brother. He's got a claim up there and sent for me after our parents passed last winter." Caleb's expression softened slightly at the mention of her loss. "My condolences, Miss Matthews. You traveling alone?" "Mrs. Matthews, actually." She saw the way his gaze flickered to her bare ring finger and added, "Widow. My husband died at Shiloh in '62. Never got around to remarrying, and when Thomas wrote saying he needed family out here, I sold the farm in Ohio and headed west." Something shifted in Caleb's posture, a subtle relaxation that Clara filed away to examine later when her nerves weren't still jangling from nearly getting shot. He secured Johnny Reed to a tree with practiced efficiency, then turned back to her with a question in his eyes. "You got coffee on?" That was how it started, with coffee strong enough to strip paint and conversation that lasted until the eastern sky began to pale with dawn. Caleb told her about his life in the mountains, trapping beaver and hunting elk, about winters so cold that whiskey froze solid and summers where the wildflowers painted entire meadows in colors that had no names. Clara spoke of Ohio, of the farm she'd worked alone for 14 years after the war took her husband, of the bone-deep loneliness that had made her brother's letter feel like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the black hills in shades of gold and amber, Caleb stood and stretched. Clara tried not to stare at the play of muscles beneath his shirt and failed utterly. He caught her looking and smiled, a slow curve of his mouth that transformed his rugged face into something dangerously appealing. "I'll escort you to Deadwood," he said, as if it were already decided. "This country's too rough for a woman alone, even one who can shoot straight." Clara wanted to argue on principle, but practicality won out. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Stone, and perhaps you'll let me pay you for your trouble." "Caleb," he corrected, "and your company will be payment enough. Gets lonely in the mountains. Sometimes a man forgets how to talk to civilized folk." They broke camp together, moving with a surprising synchronicity for two people who had just met. Caleb loaded Johnny Reed onto the back of his massive roan horse, a beast that looked like it could carry a small house, then helped Clara hitch her team to her wagon. His hands were gentle with the horses, murmuring to them in a low voice that had them calming under his touch. The road to Deadwood wound through country so beautiful it made Clara's chest ache. Pine forests stretched endlessly across the hills, broken by meadows where elk grazed in the early morning light. Caleb rode beside her wagon, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the land. He showed her where a grizzly had torn apart a tree looking for honey, where a mountain lion had its den, where the best fishing holes lay hidden in crystal-clear streams. "You love it here," Clara observed, watching the way his entire being seemed to relax the further they got from what passed for civilization. "It's home," Caleb said simply. Been in these mountains since I was 18, after the war ended. Couldn't stomach the idea of going back to Pennsylvania, to farms and fences and living elbow to elbow with neighbors. Out here, a man can breathe. You fought? Clara asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. He had that look that veterans carried, a certain wariness mixed with deep-seated fatigue. 4 years with the Army of the Potomac. Saw the elephant at Antietam, Gettysburg, all the way to Appomattox. His jaw tightened. Lost my whole family to fever while I was gone. Came home to an empty house and graves I'd never seen. So I headed west and kept going until the crowds thinned out. Clara reached across the space between horse and wagon and touched his arm. The muscle was solid as oak under her fingers, but he turned to her with eyes that held old pain. I'm sorry, Caleb. That's a heavy burden to carry alone. We all got our burdens from that war, he said quietly. You understand that better than most, I reckon. They fell into companionable silence, but Clara felt the connection between them strengthening with each mile. There was something about Caleb Stone that called to the lonely places inside her, something beyond his obvious strength and rugged appeal. He treated her like an equal, neither condescending nor overly protective, but rather like a partner whose judgment he respected. It was late afternoon when they finally saw Deadwood sprawled in the gulch below them, a chaotic jumble of buildings and tents that looked like someone had spilled a box of children's blocks down the hillside. The sound of hammering and shouting drifted up to them, along with the less pleasant smells of a mining camp crammed with too many people and insufficient sanitation. Welcome to Deadwood, Caleb said dryly. Not much to look at, but it's got character. That's one word for it, Clara replied, eyeing the muddy main street crowded with freight wagons, horses, and men who looked like they hadn't seen soap or water in weeks. They descended into the chaos together, with Caleb leading them straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Seth Bullock took possession of Johnny Reed with grim satisfaction, counted out a $20 reward that Caleb tried to give to Clara, who refused it with equal stubbornness, and finally directed Clara to where her brother's claim was located up in the hills above town. Thomas Matthews, Bullock said, nodding recognition. Good man. His claim's doing decent, not rich but steady. He'll be glad to see you, madam. He's been talking about his sister coming for months now. But when they reached the claim an hour later, climbing a rough track that barely qualified as a road, they found Thomas Matthews lying in his cabin with a broken leg and fever, bright eyes. A grizzled prospector named Old Pete was tending him, doing his best, but clearly out of his depth with serious nursing. Clara? Thomas tried to sit up and fell back with a groan. Thank God. Took a fall in the mine 3 days ago. Pete's been good to me, but I need proper doctoring. Clara was off the wagon and inside the cabin before Caleb could even dismount. She took one look at her brother's leg, saw the swelling and the way he couldn't bear weight, and made a decision. That needs to be set properly, and you need medicine for that fever. We're taking you to town. Can't afford the doctor, Thomas protested weakly. You let me worry about that, Clara said firmly. She turned to find Caleb already moving, assessing the situation with tactical precision. We'll need to splint that leg before we move him, Caleb said, and we'll take my horse. It's got the smoothest gait and he can ride with me while you drive the wagon. Between Caleb's strength and Clara's determination, they had Thomas splinted and mounted within half an hour. Old Pete promised to watch the claim, and they headed back down to Deadwood with Caleb holding Thomas steady on the horse with one powerful arm while controlling the reins with the other. Dr. Amos Fields had his office above the general store, and he took one look at Thomas's leg and whistled low. That's a bad break, but I've seen worse. Going to hurt like hell when I said it, and you'll be off that leg for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks? Thomas looked stricken. I can't leave the claim unworked for 6 weeks. Someone will jump it. Then I'll work it, Clara said. I'm not afraid of hard work. You don't know anything about mining, Thomas argued, but the protest was weak. The fever was taking hold, and the doctor was already mixing laudanum for the pain. She'll learn, Caleb said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him, and he met their gazes steadily. And I'll help. Got nothing pressing for the next few weeks, and a friend in need is worth more than beaver pelts. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words. She barely knew this man, but he was offering to turn his life upside down to help her and her brother. Caleb, you don't have to do that. You've already done so much. Want to, he he said simply. His eyes found hers and held. Unless you'd rather I didn't? I'd be grateful, Clara admitted. More than grateful. The doctor cleared his throat. If we're done with the mutual admiration, I've got a leg to set. You all might want to step outside unless you've got strong stomachs. Clara stayed, holding her brother's hand while the doctor worked. She'd seen worse during the war years when wounded soldiers had come through their town, but it never got easier to watch someone in pain. When it was finally over and Thomas was sleeping under the influence of laudanum, the doctor turned to her with a calculating look. He'll need constant care for at least a week, then monitoring after that. You capable of providing that, Mrs. Matthews? I am, Clara confirmed. Good. My fee is $20. Due whenever you can manage it. Your brother seems like an honorable man, so I'm not worried about payment. Clara thought of the small amount of money she had left from selling the farm and nodded. I'll get you your $20, Dr. Fields. You have my word. Outside, the sun was setting over the gulch, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible in their intensity. Caleb was waiting, leaning against the porch rail with his arms crossed over his broad chest. He straightened when he saw her. How is he? Sleeping. The doctor says he'll be laid up for 6 weeks at minimum. Clara rubbed her temples, feeling the full weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. I need to find somewhere to stay in town so I can be close to him, and then I need to figure out how to work a mining claim I know nothing about. Got a solution for at least part of that, Caleb said. There's a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Chen. She's fair, charges reasonable rates, and keeps a respectable establishment. As for the claim, we'll head up there tomorrow and I'll teach you what you need to know. Clara looked at him. This mountain man who had crashed into her life less than 24 hours ago and was now rearranging his entire existence to help her. Why are you doing this, Caleb? You don't owe us anything. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he looked out over the rough sprawl of Deadwood. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and honest. Been alone a long time, Clara. Years up in those mountains with nothing but my thoughts and the occasional visit to a trading post. Then you come along, shooting at thieves and talking about dead husbands and loneliness. And something just clicked. Like maybe the universe was telling me it's time to stop hiding. Clara's throat tightened with emotion. I felt it too, she admitted. When you took my hand last night, I felt something I haven't felt in 14 years, not since before the war took everything that mattered. Caleb stepped closer, and Clara caught the scent of leather and pine and something essentially male that made her pulse quicken. This is crazy, he said softly. We barely know each other. The craziest thing I've done in a decade and a half, Clara agreed, but I'm tired of being sensible and lonely. Then let's be crazy together, Caleb murmured. He didn't kiss her, not there on the main street of Deadwood with half the town wandering past, but the promise hung in the air between them, electric and undeniable. Mrs. Chen's boarding house turned out to be one of the few genuinely clean establishments in Deadwood, run by a tiny Chinese woman with a steel spine and absolutely no tolerance for nonsense. She took one look at Clara, then at Caleb, and quoted a price for a room that was exactly half what Clara had been prepared to pay. You look like decent people, Mrs. Chen said in accented but clear English. I charge decent people decent rates, meal included with room, served at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. No drinking, no gambling, no entertaining men in your room after dark. She fixed Caleb with a stare that could have melted iron. That includes you, mountain man. I see how you look at her. You want to court this lady, you do it proper. Caleb had the grace to look abashed. Yes, madam. Wouldn't dream of disrespecting Mrs. Matthews or your establishment. Good, Mrs. Chen said with a decisive nod. Now get out of here. Dinner is in 2 hours, and I have work to do. They left the boarding house and walked back toward the center of town, navigating around mud puddles and drunken prospectors with equal care. Deadwood was loud, rough, and more than a little dangerous, but Clara found she didn't mind as much as she probably should have. There was an energy to the place, a sense that anything could happen, that fortunes could be made or lost on the turn of a card or the swing of a pickaxe. You'll need supplies if you're going to work the claim, Caleb said, steering her toward a general store that looked slightly less likely to collapse than its neighbors. Picks, shovels, pans if Thomas is working a placer, and you'll need proper clothing. Can't mine in a dress. Inside the store, Clara discovered that outfitting herself for mining was going to take a significant chunk of her remaining money. But the proprietor, a jovial man named Sam who clearly knew Caleb, cut her a deal on second-hand tools and threw in a set of canvas pants and a work shirt that had belonged to his son before the boy headed back east. "On the house," Sam said when Clara tried to pay for the clothes. "Any friend of Caleb Stone's is a friend of mine. This old bear saved my life 2 winters ago when I got caught in a blizzard up near Spearfish. Wouldn't be here if he hadn't found me." Caleb shifted uncomfortably at the praise. "Just did what anyone would do, Sam." "Most men would have kept riding," Sam countered. He turned to Clara with a knowing smile. "You got yourself a good man here, Mrs. Matthews. Don't let him slip away." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks, but she didn't correct Sam's assumption. The truth was, she didn't want to let Caleb slip away. The connection between them was growing stronger by the hour, something that felt inevitable and right, despite the impossibility of falling for someone so quickly. They ate dinner at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, seated at a long table with half a dozen other boarders who ranged from a banker to a pair of theatrical performers. The food was excellent, a mix of traditional American fare and Chinese dishes that Clara had never tasted before but found delicious. Caleb ate with the single-minded focus of a man who had spent too many nights with nothing but jerky and hardtack, and Clara caught herself watching the way his throat moved when he swallowed, the way his large hands handled the chopsticks with surprising delicacy. After dinner, they sat on the boarding house's front porch while the sun completed its descent and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere down the street, a piano played badly and voices raised in drunken song. Closer, the evening sounds of a town settling in for the night, horses nickering in stables, dogs barking, the murmur of conversation from other porches. "Tell me about your husband," Caleb said quietly, "if it's not too painful." Clara considered the question, examining her feelings with care. James was a good man, kind, hard-working, devoted to the farm and to me. We married young, just 17, and I loved him the way young girls love. But then the war came and he enlisted with the Ohio Volunteers, and he marched away in a brand new uniform with a kiss and a promise to come home. Only he didn't. She paused, gathering her thoughts. For years after the notification came, I felt guilty for not missing him more than I did. We'd only had 2 years together before he left, and then he was gone for 2 more years before Shiloh. I mourned him, but it felt more like mourning a dream than a person. Does that make sense? "Perfect sense," Caleb said. "War changes everything, including how we remember the people we lose." "What about you?" Clara asked. "Any wives or sweethearts in your past?" Caleb shook his head. "Came close once. Before the war. Girl named Sarah back in Pennsylvania. But I was just a farm boy, and she was the banker's daughter, and her father made it clear I wasn't good enough. Then the war came, and by the time I got back, she'd married someone else, and my family was dead. After that, I just couldn't see the point of putting down roots anywhere." "Until now?" Clara asked softly. "Until now," Caleb agreed. He reached over and took her hand, threading his calloused fingers through hers. "This is probably too fast, too soon, but I'm 42 years old, Clara. I've been alone for most of my adult life, and I know what loneliness feels like. What I felt last night by that campfire, what I'm feeling right now, this isn't loneliness. This is something different, something worth exploring." Clara squeezed his hand, marveling at how right it felt to be touching him. "I'm 36, old enough to know my own mind and what I want, and I want to see where this goes, Caleb, wherever that might be." They sat together until Mrs. Chen came out and pointedly reminded them about her rules regarding men and women after dark. Caleb stood with a rueful smile and tipped his hat to both ladies. "I'll be back at first light," he told Clara. "We'll check on your brother and then head up to the claim." Clara watched him walk away, his broad shoulders and confident stride, marking him as different from the other men on the street. She felt Mrs. Chen's knowing gaze on her and turned to find the older woman smiling. "That one is a keeper," Mrs. Chen said. "Rare to find a man with strength and kindness in equal measure." "I'm beginning to realize that," Clara admitted. "Then don't let propriety or fear stand in your way," Mrs. Chen advised. "Life is too short and the world too hard to turn away from happiness when it finds you." Clara carried those words with her as she prepared for bed in her small but clean room. She lay awake for a long time, thinking about Caleb and the impossible speed with which her feelings were developing. By all logic, she should be cautious, should take her time, should protect her heart, but logic seemed to have little place in whatever was happening between them. This felt like something bigger than choice, like a river that had finally broken through a dam and was rushing toward the sea with inevitable force. Morning came with bright sunshine and the smell of Mrs. Chen's excellent coffee. Clara dressed in her new work clothes, feeling strange in pants but appreciating the freedom of movement they offered. Caleb was waiting on the porch, and his eyes widened appreciably when he saw her. "Well now," he said, his voice dropping to a register that made Clara's stomach flutter. "That's quite a sight." "Scandalous, I'm sure," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. "Beautiful," Caleb corrected. "You ready to learn how to be a prospector?" They stopped first to check on Thomas, who was awake but groggy and in obvious pain. The doctor assured them that everything was progressing as expected and that Thomas would be fine with rest and time. Relieved, Clara left her brother in the doctor's capable hands and followed Caleb back up to the claim. In the clear light of day, she could see that Thomas had been working a combination operation, with both a small shaft dug into the hillside and several sluice boxes set up along a nearby stream. It was backbreaking work, she realized immediately, requiring both physical strength and persistence. Caleb spent the morning teaching her the basics: how to swing a pick so that she didn't exhaust herself, how to shovel ore into a wheelbarrow and push it to the sluice boxes, how to work the running water and gravel through the riffles, watching for the telltale glint of gold. It was hard, dirty work, and within 2 hours Clara's shoulders were screaming and her hands were developing blisters despite the gloves Caleb had insisted she wear. But she didn't complain. She attacked the work with the same determination that had kept her farm running for 14 years after her husband's death, and Caleb worked beside her with the tireless strength of a man who had spent his life in hard country. They fell into a rhythm together, him breaking up the ore while she transported it, both of them working the sluices and carefully collecting the small amounts of gold that appeared. At midday, Caleb called a halt, and they sat in the shade of a pine tree, sharing the lunch Mrs. Chen had packed for them. Clara's muscles trembled with fatigue, but she felt oddly satisfied. She was doing something concrete, something that mattered, helping to secure her brother's future while he healed. "You're a natural," Caleb observed, offering her his canteen. "Most city folk would have given up by now." "Farm folk," Clara corrected, "and I learned a long time ago that giving up is a luxury I can't afford." "Still," Caleb said, admiration clear in his voice, "you've got sand, Clara Matthews, more than most men I've known." They worked through the afternoon, stopping only when the sun began its descent, and Caleb declared they'd done enough for one day. The amount of gold they'd recovered was modest but respectable, enough to prove the claim was still producing. "We'll come back tomorrow," Caleb said as they locked up the cabin, "and the day after. Between the two of us, we can keep this operation running until your brother's back on his feet." Clara started to thank him, but Caleb held up a hand. "Before you say anything, I want you to know I'm not doing this expecting anything in return. Your company is payment enough, and besides, I like the work. Been a long time since I felt useful for something other than surviving." "You're more than useful, Caleb Stone," Clara said quietly. "You're the best thing that's happened to me in more years than I care to count." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a softening that made him look younger, despite the lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair. "Same, Clara, same." They rode back to Deadwood together as the last light faded from the sky. Clara was so tired she could barely stay upright in the wagon seat, but she felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the man riding beside her. They stopped to check on Thomas again, found him sleeping peacefully, and then Caleb walked Clara back to the boarding house. "Tomorrow?" he asked at the door. "Tomorrow," Clara confirmed. This became their pattern. Each morning they would meet at first light, check on Thomas, and then head up to the claim. They worked side by side through the long spring days, their conversations ranging from profound to silly, their connection deepening with each shared joke and meaningful glance. Clara's body adapted to the hard work, muscles she hadn't known she possessed growing stronger, and every evening they would sit on Mrs. Chen's porch and talk while the stars emerged overhead. Thomas improved steadily. By the end of the first week, his fever had broken, and he was starting to take short walks with crutches. By the end of the second week, he was restless and irritable with confinement, which the doctor assured them was a sign of returning health. And through it all, Clara and Caleb grew closer, the attraction between them impossible to ignore, but kept carefully in check by propriety and Mrs. Chen's watchful eye. It was during the third week, while they were working the sluices under a brilliant blue sky, that Caleb finally broached the subject that had been hovering between them. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." She looked up from the riffle she was cleaning, her heart suddenly pounding. "All right. What happens when your brother's healed and back at work?" Caleb's dark eyes were serious, searching her face. "Do you stay here in Deadwood? Go back to Ohio? What are your plans?" Clara set down her pan and straightened, pushing a strand of hair back from her face. "Honestly, I don't know. I sold everything in Ohio. There's nothing to go back to. But I can't live off Thomas indefinitely, and I need to figure out how to support myself." "You could stay," Caleb said carefully. "Deadwood needs every kind of worker. You could open a boarding house or a laundry or a restaurant. With your determination, you'd make a success of anything you tried." "I could," Clara agreed. "But that's not really what you're asking, is it?" Caleb took a deep breath, and she saw his hands clench and unclench at his sides, this strong, confident man suddenly uncertain. "No, what I'm really asking is whether you'd consider staying for me, with me, as more than just friends or business partners." Clara's heart felt like it might burst through her ribs. "Caleb Stone, are you courting me?" "Trying to," he admitted. "Probably doing a poor job of it considering I've been out of practice for 20 years, but yes, Clara, I'm courting you, or at least I'd like permission to do so proper." She crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides and took his hands in hers. They were rough and scarred, capable of violence but gentle with her, and she loved them. She loved him, she realized with startling clarity. It had happened somewhere between that first campfire and this moment, a connection that went deeper than attraction or convenience. "You have my permission," she said softly. "And more than that, you have my heart, Caleb. I know it's fast and probably foolish, but I'm done lying to myself about what I feel." Caleb's expression transformed, joy breaking across his features like sunrise over the mountains. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "I love you," he said, the words rough with emotion. "Been trying not to, trying to be sensible, but I can't help it. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for." "I love you too," Clara whispered, "and I'm tired of being sensible." Caleb pulled her into his arms then, and she went willingly, pressing against the solid warmth of his body. He was so big that she felt tiny in his embrace, protected and cherished and utterly safe. When he finally kissed her, it was gentle at first, questioning, but Clara answered by sliding her hands into his long hair and kissing him back with all the loneliness and longing of the past 14 years. They broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads touching, and Caleb laughed softly. "Mrs. Chen is going to have words with me." "Let her," Clara said recklessly. "I'm a grown woman, and I'll kiss who I please." "Still," Caleb said, though he didn't let her go, "I want to do this right. You deserve proper courting, not some hasty tumble in the mountains." "I know," Clara sighed. "You're right. But I reserve the right to complain about propriety." They spent the rest of the afternoon working with renewed energy, stealing glances and touches when they could. By the time they headed back to Deadwood, Clara felt like she was glowing from the inside out. Thomas took one look at her face when they stopped to visit him and grinned knowingly. "About time," her brother said. "I've been watching you two dance around each other for weeks. Was starting to think you'd never figure it out." "We're not that obvious," Clara protested, but Thomas just laughed. "Clara, everyone in Deadwood knows. The way Caleb looks at you could melt snow in January. I'm just glad you're finally admitting it." That night, Caleb formally asked Thomas for permission to court Clara, a gesture that was old-fashioned even by 1876 standards, but which touched Clara deeply. Thomas gave his blessing with genuine warmth, shaking Caleb's hand and welcoming him to the family. "Take care of her," Thomas said seriously. "She's been through enough hard times. She deserves happiness." "I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure she has it," Caleb replied, and the sincerity in his voice made Clara's eyes sting with tears. Word of their courtship spread through Deadwood with the speed of wildfire. Mrs. Chen approved vocally and publicly, which apparently carried significant weight in the community. Sam at the general store congratulated them. Even Sheriff Bullock nodded his acknowledgement when he saw them together on the street. But not everyone was pleased. There was a man named Jack Thornton who had been pressuring Thomas to sell his claim, and he seemed to view Clara's arrival and subsequent relationship with Caleb as an impediment to his plans. Thornton was a big man, though not as large as Caleb, with mean eyes and a reputation for playing dirty in business deals. Clara first encountered Thornton's displeasure when she was in town buying supplies alone one afternoon. Caleb was helping Thomas with physical therapy exercises, and Clara had wanted to give the brothers some time together. She was loading bags of cornmeal into her wagon when Thornton approached, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Mrs. Matthews," he said with false courtesy, "I hear your brother's claim is doing well under your management." "Well enough," Clara replied carefully, not liking the way Thornton was standing too close, using his size to intimidate. "I've made Thomas several offers to buy him out," Thornton continued. "Generous offers, but he keeps refusing. Perhaps you could convince him to see reason." "My brother makes his own decisions," Clara said firmly, "and if he's refused your offers, I'm sure he has good reasons." Thornton's expression hardened. "Everything in Deadwood has a price, Mrs. Matthews. Your brother would do well to remember that. Accidents happen in mining camps. Would be a shame if something unfortunate occurred." Before Clara could respond, a shadow fell across them both. Caleb had appeared with the silent grace of a hunting cat, and the look on his face was absolutely terrifying. Clara had seen him protective, had seen him kind, had even seen him dangerous when he'd captured Johnny Reed. But this was something else entirely, a cold fury that promised violence. "Did you just threaten this lady?" Caleb's voice was soft, which somehow made it more menacing. Thornton took an involuntary step back. "Just making conversation, Stone. No need to get yourself worked up." "If I hear you've been anywhere near Clara or her brother again," Caleb said, moving closer until he towered over Thornton, despite both men being tall. "If I even hear you've spoken their names, I will take it personally. And Jack, you really don't want me taking things personally." Thornton tried to bluster, but it was clear he was outmatched. He backed away with a few muttered words and disappeared into the crowd on Main Street. Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said quietly. "He was starting to frighten me." Caleb's fury melted away instantly, replaced by concern. He cupped her face in his hands, gentle despite the violence that had been radiating from him moments before. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "Just scared me a little," Clara admitted. "He threatened Thomas, implied that accidents could happen." "Not while I'm around," Caleb said firmly. "I'll talk to Bullock, let him know Thornton's making threats, and I'm not letting you come into town alone anymore, not until we're sure Thornton's gotten the message." Clara wanted to argue that she could take care of herself, but the truth was, she felt relieved by Caleb's protectiveness. There was a difference between being independent and being foolish, and antagonizing a man like Thornton fell into the latter category. That evening, Caleb spoke with Sheriff Bullock, who promised to keep an eye on Thornton. But the sheriff also warned them that there was only so much he could do unless Thornton actually broke the law. "Best advice I can give is to stay alert and stick together," Bullock said. "Thornton's mean and greedy, but he's also a coward. He won't try anything if he thinks he'll face real opposition." They took the warning seriously. Caleb moved his camp to the area around Thomas's claim, and he and Clara established a routine where one of them was always present at the mine while the other was in town. Thomas was improving rapidly now, able to manage short periods of light work, though the doctor insisted he not return to full mining duties for at least another few weeks. During this time, Clara and Caleb's relationship deepened further. They stole moments alone when they could, kisses in the cabin when Thomas was napping, quiet conversations by the creek in the evenings. Caleb told her about his dreams of having a real home again, about maybe expanding Thomas's operation or starting his own claim. Clara shared her own hopes about building something lasting, about finally having a family again. "Marry me," Caleb said one evening as they sat by the creek watching the water rush past. It wasn't a question, but rather a statement of intent, and Clara's heart soared. "Yes," she said without hesitation. Yes, absolutely yes. Caleb kissed her then with a passion that made her dizzy, his hands tangling in her hair, her body pressed against his solid warmth. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. Soon, he said. I don't want to wait long. Neither do I, Clara agreed. As soon as Thomas is well enough to stand up with us. They told Thomas that night, and her brother embraced them both with genuine joy. About damn time, he said, using language that made Clara raise her eyebrows, but which made Caleb laugh. When's the wedding? As soon as you're healed enough to participate, Clara said. We want you there, healthy and standing on your own feet. Then I'll work twice as hard at getting better, Thomas promised. Word of the engagement spread through Deadwood even faster than the courtship announcement had. Mrs. Chen immediately declared she would host the wedding reception at her boarding house, refusing to take no for an answer. Sam donated a bolt of cloth for a wedding dress, and several of the women in town volunteered to help sew it. The community was embracing them, Clara realized, accepting them as their own. Even the rough prospectors and hardened gamblers seemed pleased by the news. Marriage was rare enough in Deadwood's predominantly male population that any wedding was cause for celebration. And there was something about Clara and Caleb's story that appealed to people, the widow and the mountain man finding love in the Black Hills. The only dark cloud on the horizon was Jack Thornton. He continued to lurk around the edges of their lives, never quite doing anything actionable, but making his presence felt. Tools would go missing from the claim, only to turn up in strange places. Their supplies in town would be accidentally damaged. Nothing major, but enough to let them know Thornton hadn't forgotten or forgiven. He's like a dog with a bone, Thomas said in frustration, after discovering someone had damaged one of their sluice boxes. Just won't let it go. He'll give up eventually, Caleb said, though his jaw was tight with anger. Men like Thornton are bullies. They only persist when they think they can win. He's starting to realize that's not going to happen here. But 3 days before the wedding was scheduled, Thornton made his move. Clara had gone into town for final dress fittings while Caleb and Thomas were working the claim. She was walking back to the boarding house, arms full of packages, when Thornton stepped out of an alley, blocking her path. Mrs. Matthews, he said, and this time there was no pretense of courtesy. You and your people have been a thorn in my side for too long. Clara's hand moved toward the small pistol she'd taken to carrying in her pocket, but Thornton was faster. He grabbed her wrist with bruising force, his other hand covering her mouth to stifle her scream. He dragged her into the alley, and Clara fought with every ounce of strength she possessed, kicking and biting and struggling. But Thornton was strong and mean, and he slammed her against the wall hard enough to make her vision blur. Going to teach you some manners, he snarled, and when Stone comes looking for you, I'll teach him too. Nobody crosses Jack Thornton and walks away. Clara felt real terror then, understanding that Thornton had moved beyond threats into genuine violence. She clawed at his face, drawing blood, and he backhanded her hard enough to split her lip. She tasted copper and felt fury rising through the fear. She would not be a victim, would not let this man hurt her or the people she loved. She managed to get her hand on a broken board lying in the alley, and she swung it at Thornton's head with all her strength. He ducked, but it caught him in the shoulder and gave her enough space to scream. "Caleb, help!" Thornton cursed and grabbed for her again, but Clara was already moving, running toward the open street in safety. She made it perhaps 10 feet before Thornton caught her dress and yanked her backward, but those 10 feet and that scream had been enough. Caleb came around the corner like an avalanche, and the look on his face would have terrified Clara if it had been directed at her. Behind him was Thomas, limping but mobile, and Sheriff Bullock with his gun drawn. Thornton released Clara immediately, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender that fooled no one. "She attacked me," Thornton tried to claim, but the words died in his throat as Caleb advanced on him with lethal intent. "Caleb, no!" Clara called out, afraid of what Caleb might do. "I'm all right. Don't let him make you do something you'll regret." Caleb stopped, though every muscle in his body was coiled for violence. Bullock moved between them, his gun now pointed at Thornton. "Jack Thornton, I'm placing you under arrest for assault," the sheriff said. "We've got multiple witnesses who saw you drag Mrs. Matthews into that alley, and her injuries speak for themselves." Thornton opened his mouth to protest, but Bullock cut him off. Save it for the judge. If you're lucky, they'll just run you out of the territory. If you're not, you'll be seeing the inside of a cell for a long time." As Bullock led Thornton away in handcuffs, Caleb rushed to Clara, his hands running over her with desperate care, checking for injuries. "Your face," he said hoarsely, touching the split lip and the bruise already forming on her cheek with feather-light fingers. "God, Clara, I thought I'd lost you." "I'm fine," Clara assured him, though she was shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Scared, and I'll be sore tomorrow, but fine. You came just in time." Thomas embraced her carefully, mindful of his still healing leg. "You're one tough lady, sis. The way you were fighting, I almost felt sorry for Thornton." Clara managed a wobbly laugh. "I had a good teacher," she said, looking at Caleb. "You taught me to fight back, to not give up. That saved me today." Caleb pulled her against his chest, holding her like she was precious and fragile. "I'm never letting you out of my sight again," he said into her hair. "Never." Mrs. Chen fussed over Clara that evening, applying salve to her bruises and bringing her tea laced with whiskey to calm her nerves. The other boarders stopped by to check on her, offering support and outrage in equal measure. By morning, the entire town knew what had happened, and the general sentiment was that Thornton had gotten what he deserved. The trial was swift. With multiple witnesses and Clara's injuries as evidence, the judge found Thornton guilty of assault and attempted extortion. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and permanent banishment from the Dakota Territory upon release. As they led Thornton away, he shot Clara one last venomous look, but she met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "It's over," Caleb said, his arm around her waist as they left the courthouse. "He can't hurt you anymore." "We can finally focus on the future," Clara agreed. "On us." The wedding took place 3 days later, as originally planned. Clara wore the dress the town women had made, a beautiful creation of cream-colored silk that had somehow appeared courtesy of a donor who refused to be named. Her face still showed the fading bruises from Thornton's attack, but Caleb said she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and the love in his eyes made Clara believe him. The ceremony was held in the small church that Deadwood had recently built, with a traveling preacher officiating. Thomas stood up for both of them, his leg healed enough that he only needed a cane for support. Mrs. Chen cried openly, and even Sheriff Bullock looked misty-eyed. Half the town crammed into the church and spilled out into the street, everyone wanting to witness the wedding of the year. When the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife, and Caleb kissed Clara with a tenderness that made her knees weak, the entire crowd erupted in cheers. They walked out of the church hand in hand to a hail of rice and well-wishes, and Caleb lifted Clara into his arms and carried her through the street with a grin that seemed too big for his face. But the moment that Clara would remember forever came that evening at the reception. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself, transforming her boarding house's dining room into something magical with flowers and candles and food enough to feed 3 times the people who attended. There was music and dancing, laughter and joy, and Clara felt happier than she could ever remember being. They were standing near the entrance, greeting newcomers, when a group of prospectors from the neighboring claims arrived. These were rough men, weathered by hard living and harder work, men who rarely came to town, and when they did, usually headed straight for the saloons. Their leader, a grizzled veteran named Dutch Henry, approached Caleb and Clara with his hat in his hands. "Wanted to pay our respects," he said gruffly, "and to meet the lady." Caleb straightened, his hand at the small of Clara's back, and the pride in his posture was unmistakable. "Dutch, I'd like you to meet my wife, Clara Stone." The simple words, "my wife," were said with such deep satisfaction and pride that every man in the room seemed to feel it. Dutch Henry looked at Clara, taking in her split lip and the fading bruises on her face from Thornton's attack, then at Caleb, then back at Clara. He nodded slowly, a gesture of profound respect. "Madam," he said formally, "it's an honor. We heard what happened with Thornton, heard how you fought back. That took real courage." One by one, the other prospectors stepped forward, each offering similar words of respect and congratulations. And each man, as he turned away, nodded his head in acknowledgement, a wordless communication between men that spoke of approval and acceptance. These were hard men from a hard land, and they recognized in Clara the same strength and determination that they valued in themselves. Caleb's pride was palpable. He stood a little straighter, held Clara a little closer, and when he looked down at her, his eyes were shining with emotion. "That's my wife," he said again, seemingly unable to stop himself, and Clara felt her heart might burst with happiness. They danced together as the evening wore on, Caleb surprisingly graceful for such a large man. He held her close, guiding her through the simple steps, and Clara rested her head against his broad chest and felt utterly content. This was what she'd been missing for 14 long years, this sense of belonging, of being cherished, of having a partner who saw her not as property or obligation, but as an equal. "What are you thinking?" Caleb murmured into her hair. "That I'm the luckiest woman alive," Clara said honestly, "and that I can't wait to start our life together." "About that," Caleb said, pulling back slightly to meet her eyes. "I've been thinking about the future. Thomas's claim is doing well, but with 3 of us working it, we could really make something of it. I was thinking maybe we could expand, bring in more equipment, maybe even hire a few men. Build it into a real operation. Or," Clara said slowly, an idea forming, "we could start our own claim. Thomas loves that mine, loves working it himself. But you and I, we could find our own spot, build something that's just ours." Caleb's eyes lit up. "I like that idea. There's territory up north that I've been through, good land near Spearfish Creek, rich country that hasn't been fully explored yet." "Then that's what we'll do," Clara said decisively. "We'll help Thomas until he's fully healed and the mine's on solid footing. Then we'll strike out on our own, build our own future." "Our own home," Caleb added, and the longing in his voice was clear. "A real home, Clara, with a garden and maybe some chickens and room to grow." "Room for a family?" Clara asked softly, and Caleb's expression became tender. "If we're blessed," he agreed. "I'd like children, if you would. A chance to build the family I lost all those years ago." "I'd like that very much," Clara whispered. They left the reception eventually, walking through Deadwood streets to the small house that Caleb had rented for them, a proper home instead of a boarding house room. It was modest but clean, and Mrs. Chen and several other women had decorated it with flowers and stocked the kitchen with supplies. That night, Clara finally understood what she'd been missing in her first marriage. James had been a kind man and a good husband in his way, but their intimacy had been fumbling and brief, more duty than pleasure. With Caleb, everything was different. He took his time, exploring her body with reverent attention, making her feel cherished and desired in equal measure. When they finally came together, it was with a passion that left Clara breathless and utterly satisfied. Afterward, she lay in Caleb's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His hand stroked slowly through her hair, and she felt a contentment so deep it almost frightened her. "I love you," Caleb said into the darkness, "more than I thought possible." "I love you too," Clara replied. "Thank you for finding me, for choosing me." "Thank you for shooting at that thief," Caleb said with a soft laugh. "If you hadn't been brave enough to fight back, I might have ridden right past your camp and missed the best thing that ever happened to me." They fell asleep tangled together, and Clara dreamed of mountains and gold dust, of a home built with their own hands, and children playing in wildflower meadows. The next months passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Clara and Caleb spent their days helping Thomas bring his mine to full production and their evenings planning their own future. True to his word, Thomas insisted he could manage the mine himself once he was fully healed, encouraging his sister and new brother-in-law to pursue their own dreams. In late summer, they set out for Spearfish Creek with a wagon full of supplies and hearts full of hope. The land Caleb had remembered proved to be everything he'd promised, a valley where the creek ran clear and cold through stands of pine and aspen. They staked their claim, registered it properly in both their names, and set about building their life. The first winter was hard. They lived in a canvas tent while Caleb built a cabin, racing against the approaching cold. Clara learned to hunt and trap alongside her husband, discovering skills she'd never imagined possessing. They worked from dawn to dusk, felling trees, notching logs, and raising walls that would shelter them from the brutal Dakota winter. The cabin was finished just days before the first major snowstorm hit, and Clara stood in the center of their one-room home with tears of joy streaming down her face. It wasn't much, just 4 walls, a roof, a stone fireplace, and a sleeping loft, but it was theirs. Built with their own hands, on land they owned, it represented everything they'd fought for. That winter, snowbound and isolated, they grew even closer. Caleb taught Clara to read animal tracks in the snow and to predict weather by the behavior of birds. Clara taught Caleb to cook more than just basic survival fare, creating meals that made their small cabin feel like a real home. They made love by firelight and told stories to pass the long evenings, creating a shared history to replace the lonely years they had each endured. Spring brought a surprise. Clara realized she was pregnant in March, when the snow was still deep but the days were growing longer. She told Caleb one evening as they sat by the fire, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He pulled her into his arms and held her like she was made of spun glass, his voice choked with emotion. "A baby," he kept saying. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Caleb said fervently. "Terrified, overwhelmed, grateful, but mostly just so damn happy I could burst." They spent that summer preparing for their child's arrival. Caleb built a cradle from pine wood, carving it with a care and attention that made Clara cry. She sewed tiny clothes and blankets, nesting with an intensity that amused and touched her husband, and they worked their claim, finding enough gold to ensure they'd have money to see them through Clara's confinement and the baby's first months. Thomas visited in July, riding up with supplies and news from Deadwood. His mind was thriving, and he'd taken on a partner to help with the work. He was planning to propose to a schoolteacher who had arrived in town that spring, and his happiness at seeing Clara healthy and pregnant was genuine. "You look good, sis," he said, studying her expanded waistline and glowing face. "This life agrees with you." "It does," Clara agreed. "I never thought I could be this happy, Thomas. Never imagined life could feel this full." "You deserve it," Thomas said firmly. "After everything you went through, all those years alone, you deserve every bit of happiness you've found." The baby came in November, during an early snowstorm that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Clara's labor was long and difficult, and there were hours when Caleb feared he might lose both wife and child. But Clara was strong, stronger than he'd ever imagined, and when she finally delivered a healthy baby boy into his shaking hands, Caleb wept openly with relief and joy. They named him James Thomas Stone, after Clara's first husband and her brother, a gesture that honored the past while celebrating the future. The baby had Caleb's dark hair and Clara's gray eyes, and from the first moment he had his father wrapped completely around his tiny fingers. Caleb was transformed by fatherhood. This mountain man who had lived alone for 20 years became the most devoted parent Clara could imagine. He would pace the cabin floor for hours with a crying baby, sing lullabies in his rumbling voice, and stare at his son with an expression of wonder that never quite faded. "I can't believe he's ours," Caleb would say, watching James sleep in his carved cradle, "that we made this perfect little person." "Believe it," Clara would reply, her heart full as she watched her husband with their son. The years that followed were good ones. Their claim proved to be profitable enough to provide a comfortable living without making them wealthy. They expanded the cabin, adding a second room and a proper kitchen. Clara planted a garden that flourished in the mountain soil, and Caleb built a chicken coop and acquired a milk cow. James grew into a sturdy, curious little boy with his father's fearlessness and his mother's determination. When he was 2, Clara discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she delivered a daughter they named Sarah Rose, after Caleb's lost love and Clara's own mother. Sarah had Clara's blonde hair and Caleb's dark eyes, and she ruled the household from the moment she drew breath. Thomas married his schoolteacher, a woman named Elizabeth, who became Clara's dear friend. They had 3 children of their own, and the 2 families would gather several times a year, creating traditions and memories that bound them together. Deadwood continued to grow and change around them. The wild lawlessness of the early days gave way to a more settled community. The town incorporated, built schools and churches, and slowly transformed from a mining camp into a real town. Clara and Caleb would go down several times a year for supplies and socializing, and each time they were greeted warmly by friends and neighbors who had watched their family grow. Mrs. Chen remained a fixture in their lives, her boarding house now one of the most respected establishments in Deadwood. She doted on Clara's children, always having candy tucked away in her pockets and stories of far-off China to entrance them. She grew old gracefully, and when she finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 78, Clara wept like she'd lost her own mother. As the years passed, Caleb and Clara's love only deepened. They weathered hard times together, including a winter when Caleb broke his leg and Clara had to manage everything alone, and boom times when their claim paid out beyond their expectations. They raised their children with love and firmness, teaching them to respect the land and each other, to work hard, and to value family above all else. James grew into a young man as strong and capable as his father, with a wanderlust that eventually took him to Montana, where he established his own ranch. Sarah married a banker's son from Deadwood and settled in town, giving Clara and Caleb 4 grandchildren who adored their mountain-dwelling grandparents. On their 20th anniversary, Caleb took Clara back to the spot where they had first kissed, by the creek near Thomas's claim. The area had changed, with more mines and more people, but the creek still ran clear, and the mountains still stood eternal against the sky. 20 years, Caleb marveled, holding Clara's hand. They were both graying now, with lines on their faces and calluses on their hands, but to each other they were still the people who had fallen in love that spring in 1876. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like a lifetime. The best lifetime, Clara said, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. I wouldn't change a single moment. Not even Thornton? Caleb asked with a wry smile. Not even Thornton, Clara confirmed, because even that showed me how strong I could be, how much you loved me even then. Everything we've been through, good and bad, made us who we are. Caleb kissed her temple, a gesture so familiar and dear that Clara felt tears prick her eyes. I love you, Clara Stone. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. I love you too, Clara replied. My mountain man, my husband, my home. They stood together as the sun set over the black hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In the distance they could hear the sounds of Deadwood, the town that had brought them together. Closer, the creek sang its eternal song, and somewhere an elk bugled its challenge to the approaching night. It had been 20 years since a mountain man had introduced his wife with a pride that made every man in the room nod his head. 20 years of building a life together in the wild country, of raising children and working claims, of weathering storms, both literal and figurative. And through it all, through every hardship and every triumph, Clara and Caleb had stood together, their love the bedrock on which everything else was built. As they walked back to their horse and wagon, ready to return to their cabin and the life they'd made, Clara thought about that young widow who had headed west, with nothing but determination and a brother's invitation. She barely recognized that woman now, so much had changed. But in the best possible ways, Clara thought, in all the best ways. Their cabin was warm when they arrived home. The fire kept burning by Sarah, who had promised to check on things while they were gone. She'd left stew warming on the stove and fresh bread on the table, and Clara felt a rush of love for her thoughtful daughter. We raised good kids, Caleb observed, spooning out stew for both of them. We did, Clara agreed. They'll make their own way in the world, build their own lives, but they'll always know where home is. Here, Caleb said, looking around their cabin with satisfaction, with us in these mountains. They ate dinner together as the night deepened outside, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the claim and their plans for the coming year. These were the rhythms of their life, comfortable and familiar, yet never boring because they were shared. Later, in the loft where they'd slept for 20 years, Caleb pulled Clara close. She fit against him perfectly, her head on his shoulder, their legs tangled together in a configuration they'd perfected over 2 decades. Do you ever regret it? Caleb asked softly. Leaving Ohio, coming to this hard country, choosing this life? Clara didn't even have to think about her answer. Never. Not for a single second. This life, this place, you and our children, it's everything I never knew I wanted. You saved me, Caleb. That night when you stopped that thief, you saved more than just my life. You saved me from a future of loneliness and regret. You saved me too, Caleb replied, his arms tightening around her. I was so lost before you came along, Clara. Living but not really alive, just going through the motions. You gave me purpose, gave me love, gave me a reason to stop hiding in the mountains and start building something real. They made love that night with the slow, deep knowledge of long practice, taking their time to pleasure each other, to reaffirm the connection that bound them. And afterward, as Clara drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, she thought about how strange and wonderful life could be, how a chance encounter could change everything, how love could grow in the most unlikely places. The years continued to pass, bringing change and challenges, but also joy and growth. Caleb's hair turned fully silver, making him look like some ancient mountain sage. Clara's hands grew gnarled with arthritis, though she never complained. They slowed down gradually, taking on less strenuous work, eventually selling their claim to a young couple who reminded them so much of their younger selves that they could only laugh. They moved to Deadwood permanently when Clara was 62 and Caleb was 68, buying a small house near where Mrs. Chen's boarding house had stood. The building had been converted to a library, a transformation Mrs. Chen would have approved of, and Clara volunteered there twice a week, reading to children and helping maintain the collection. Caleb became something of a legend in Deadwood, the mountain man who had found love and domesticity without ever losing his essential wildness. Young men would seek him out for advice about trapping and hunting, and he would hold court on his front porch, telling stories about the old days when Deadwood was nothing but tents and dreams. But his favorite moments were still the quiet ones with Clara. Evening walks through town, their steps slower, but their hands still clasped. Sunday dinners with Sarah and her family, the house filled with the noise and chaos of grandchildren. Letters from James in Montana describing his ranch and his own growing family. On their 30th anniversary, the whole family gathered in Deadwood. James came down from Montana with his wife and 3 children. Sarah hosted the celebration at her large house, and Thomas and Elizabeth came with their adult children and grandchildren. The house was bursting at the seams with family. 3 generations gathered to celebrate the love that had started everything. During the dinner, Thomas stood to make a toast. 30 years ago, he said, his voice carrying over the assembled family, my sister came west to help me with my claim. I thought I was doing her a favor, giving her a place to land after our parents died. But it turned out she was the one doing me a favor. Because she brought Caleb into our lives, and between them, they built something beautiful. A love that has weathered everything life could throw at it. A family that stretches from here to Montana and beyond. A legacy of strength and kindness and determination. He raised his glass and everyone in the room followed suit. To Clara and Caleb, to 30 years of love, and to many more to come. To Clara and Caleb, the room echoed, and Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she looked around at all these people, this family that she and Caleb had created together. That night, back in their own small house, Caleb held Clara close, and they watched the stars through their bedroom window. 30 years, he marveled, and I love you more today than I did that first night by your campfire. I love you too, Clara whispered. You're still my mountain man, still the man who makes every other man nod his head in respect, still the best thing that ever happened to me. We've had a good life, Caleb said, and it wasn't a question. The best life, Clara agreed, full of love and family and adventure. What more could anyone ask for? They lived another 10 years in Deadwood, watching their grandchildren grow and begin families of their own. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by 4 generations of family, with great-grandchildren running around their feet and making them laugh with their antics. Caleb died peacefully in his sleep 2 months after their 50th anniversary, his hand in Clara's, his last words a whispered, I love you. Clara mourned him with a grief that was profound but not bitter, because they had been blessed with 50 years together, 5 decades of love and partnership that many people never experienced even once. She lived another 3 years after Caleb's passing, spending her time with family and friends, tending a small garden and volunteering at the library. She spoke often of Caleb, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who hadn't known him in his prime. She told stories about the mountain man who had saved her from a thief and then proceeded to save her from loneliness, about the strength in his hands and the gentleness in his heart, about the way he had looked at her that first evening, with pride that made every man in the room nod his head. When Clara finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 79, surrounded by photographs of the family she and Caleb had built, her last thought was of that night by the campfire. of coffee and conversation, of a mountain man emerging from the shadows, of the moment when her life had changed forever. And she went with a smile on her face, knowing that somewhere beyond the veil, Caleb was waiting for her, ready to start the next adventure together. They were buried side by side in the Deadwood cemetery, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their lives. But their real monument was the family they left behind, generations of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their legacy of love, strength, and determination forward into the future. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the Black Hills, old-timers in Deadwood would tell the story of the mountain man and the widow who had found each other in the wild country. They would talk about how Caleb had introduced Clara as his wife, with a pride that made every man in the room nod his head, recognizing in their union something rare and precious. They would speak of the life they had built together, of the love that had sustained them through 50 years of joy and hardship, of the family that was their greatest achievement. It was a story that never got old, a reminder that even in the hardest country, in the wildest times, love could flourish and grow. That two lonely people could find each other against all odds and build something that would last long after they were gone. That the best adventures were the ones you shared with someone whose hand you wanted to hold through whatever came next. And in that way, Clara and Caleb Stone lived on, their love story becoming part of the legend of Deadwood, part of the history of the Black Hills, part of the great tapestry of the American West. Two souls who had found each other in the spring of 1876 and who had never let go, not through life and not in death. Forever the mountain man and his wife, forever together, forever home.